The church bells folded into the morning like metal breaths, each ring a clear cut that opened air and let cold light slide along the stone. Outside, the scent of late summer bees and cut hay drifted in from the orchards beyond town, an odd sweetness tangled with the sharp floral perfume of the bouquet she pressed to her chest. Elena Hart stood beneath a stained glass window, fingers curled around a handful of wildflowers that had been wired into a formal arrangement, the petals sticky with honey from her new husband's hives. Her veil trembled against the wind of footsteps, and the sound in the mave shifted from polite rustling to a focused hush, as if the room itself waited for permission to breathe. At the front, Vincent Archer sat with the flat composure of someone who assessed people the way others read ledgers, his suit immaculate, jaw set like a verdict. When he leaned forward and said, in a voice that carried the authority of a councilman used to carrying favors, "I have done what I said I would," the words landed not as comfort, but as a calculation. Elena's smile was small and practiced. It touched her lips, but did not reach her eyes. There had been limousines, polished shoes, the polite clink of crystal, but none of that had been hers to savor. Someone else had counted the cost and written down the price. The promise that hovered in the room was simple and terrible. A name would be given in exchange for medicine. A marriage would be signed like a loan. Outside the church, the town moved as if on learned habit, a baker loading boxes, a truck humming past, the slow hum of the apiary where Nathan Cole tended hives, unaware of how fate had arranged the next chapter. And the question that hung under the chandeliers was as plain as it was inexorable. How much could one heart pay to buy another life? The limousine smelled of leather and something faintly antiseptic, the air conditioner pushing cool onto Elena's cheeks while a taxi driver idled by the curb. Nathan sat beside her, with hands calloused from frames and frames of comb, his shirt dusted with pollen, the sleeves rolled because he always rolled them to work. They had married in a ceremony arranged between a debt and a promise, and in the car, the rules of that marriage were given like a set of instructions delivered by trained clerks. The exchange began with a clipped question from Samuel Price, the elder lawyer who had drawn the agreement, and escalated into a list that left Elena feeling small and boxed. Samuel Price said, "We will keep this simple," and then he listed terms with the same evenness he used to list parcels at an auction. Elena answered once, softly, "I understand," and Nathan squeezed her hand like a man anchoring a drifting boat. Then Rebecca Lyle, her friend who had stayed by her, sighed through overdrafts and calls from collectors, pressed for details. "Are you sure about all this?" And Elena repeated the word yes until it sounded like a thread she could pull herself along. The driver did not speak. Vincent did, quietly. "This arrangement is temporary," and when he did, his tone bore the weight of a man who had already made a ledger in which her family was balanced with favors given. The conversation moved on to expectations, to household lines, to the way Nathan kept bees, and Elena would keep accounts, to the absolute rule that she would not speak of debts publicly. Each exchange was a small oath. The car passed the hospital where Rose Hart had been admitted, its lights a square cut into the afternoon. Elena pressed her forehead to the cool glass and felt the hum of life in far rooms, the beeping of distant monitors she could not see. In that cramped, air-conditioned space, the rules of the marriage hardened into something she could not unsee. Save her mother, accept a new life, and do not look back. The fall came in pieces like torn curtains. First, the auction, where items that had once meant lineage and stories were lifted and knocked with little fanfare. Then the call from Dr. Amelia Chin with numbers that made Elena's stomach fall as if a trapdoor had opened beneath her. Rose Hart's diagnosis was a tangle of medical words that settled into a single relentless need. a treatment available only through a specialty program tied to an affiliated hospital and an experimental protocol with a price that outstripped what their savings or an overdraft could cover. Claire Benson, the appraiser, called to catalog the remaining family heirlooms, listed each piece clinically under the flicker of fluorescent light, and the town's whisper turned into a naked gaze. Elena watched as their living room was emptied into labeled boxes, the sound of lids closing like small verdicts. Nathan came with jars of honey and a quiet that wrapped around Elena, and together they stood at the curb while movers took away portraits that had hung for generations. The numbers drilled into her: treatment, surgery, hospital stay, living costs for a month of convalescence. Samuel Price outlined payment plans with paper and signatures, and Vincent Archer's offer came with perfect timing. "I can cover Rose Hart's treatment if you accept this." There was no mercy in the phrasing, only terms. Elena felt the weight of overdraft statements she could no longer face, the ledger of shame that had followed her family since the business failure. The choice presented itself stripped of romance: refuse and watch the hospital bills pile, accept and sign away certain freedoms in exchange for medicine. When Rose's hand closed around Elena's fingers over the phone, the tremor in her voice was small and brave. "Do it," she whispered. "Do what you must." That voice was the reason Elena walked into a decision that would change the axis of her life. Vincent's plan formed like a machine assembled quietly in a dark room. He paced the penthouse study where his office overlooked the river, the city lights reflecting in the glass like coins laid out to be counted. He mapped how a marriage to a beekeeper would be less likely to attract curiosity than a union with someone of his own circle, and how it could be spun into a story of humble charity that would burnish his reputation while resolving old debts. Vincent talked to Councilman James Harrow about optics and to Claire Benson about appraisal values, and when he was alone, he wrote notes in a ledger with lines and margins where favors could be scored. He rehearsed conversations, adjusted the financial sheet, and considered how to pressure Elena with kindness that was really leverage. In one room, he called his son, though he did not let the boy speak much, and reminded him of the necessity of discretion. When Mateo Cruz, a paramedic who knew the Hart family, came by to ask about hospital logistics, Vincent smiled and said, "Everything will be taken care of," as if that smile could seal debts. He believed he was saving a life and shielding his own name at the same time. But his calculus left out a variable he could not foresee: Nathan Cole's hidden lineage. Vincent's eye for advantage blinded him to the way secrets could upset the scales. He thought he had placed the pieces so that nobody would question their edges, but fate has a way of bending even the most careful plan. The early months of married life were built on routines that felt foreign to Elena. She learned the rhythm of Nathan's days. At dawn, he walked among rows of boxes that hummed with the work of thousands of bees. He checked frames, smoked hives with a practiced hand, and returned with jars of honey that smelled of wildflower and sun. At night, he cleaned his boots, mended netting, and sat on the porch with a cup of tea that tasted faintly of smoke and lavender. Their home was small and warm, with sun on the kitchen table and the quiet creak of a house that had stood generations. But between them, there flowed a distance like a river. Nathan's simplicity and Elena's social world had been thrown together by necessity, and the intimacy they shared was at first transactional, then habitual, then, in small, surprising moments, tender. Rebecca visited frequently, bringing soups and old magazines, and would ask casually, "How are you really?" And Elena would say, "Better than yesterday," which was true and false at once. Nathan rarely spoke of his past. He spoke instead of bees, of the fragile economy of pollen, of the way seasons altered sweetness. But there were small humiliations built into the bargain. A dinner given by Vincent where someone murmured about family reputation in tones that left Elena red-faced. A whispered joke about marrying under duress that skimmed the surface of cruelty. Nathan listened, sometimes surprised and sometimes defensive, and together they had conversations that started with awkward silences and ended in practical decisions about bills and dress repairs. In those talks, their voices creaked into familiarity. The dialogue between them at the breakfast table became a ritual with many exchanges. Elena would act about hive counts. Nathan would respond with numbers and then ask about her mother's latest appointment. Rebecca would chime in with local gossip. Samuel Price would call to remind them of paperwork. Dr. Amelia Chen would request authorization for tests. Each call added a layer to the fabric of their days, sometimes tightening it, sometimes fraying it. It was in the small hours that betrayal first arrived in the shape of a glowing screen. Elena's phone lit the dark with messages that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Photos, exchanges, a thread that had been doctored and laid like bait. The proof appeared seamless. Images of Nathan with another woman, a series of texts implying intimacy, details curated in a way that read like evidence. Elena's breath hitched when she scrolled, the light from the phone staining her face with blue. She confronted Nathan in a scene that was pure, naked confrontation, each sentence a thrown stone. The room smelled faintly of honey and lemon cleaners. The night air pressed at the windows. Dialogue poured out of them in a rush of sentences, questions and denials and answers that cut and bled. Elena said, "How could you?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" And she showed him the phone, and he blinked, then laughed, then grew white. Their conversation stretched into a dozen exchanges, raw and precise, ending with Elena packing a bag and running down the road as if she could run to some place where the truth would be less sharp. She smashed into the wet street, tires screeching, the sound like a struck chord, and then metal and glass, and the world changed. The accident was a shard of sensation that opened into a long, intimate chapter. Sound reduced to pain and a high white rush. Smell turned into the iron tang of blood and the sharp antiseptic of a hospital gurney. Touch was the surprising pressure of another hand at her shoulder, urgent and real. Mateo Cruz arrived first, and his voice was calm and close. "Elena, stay with me," he said, and his hands were professional and warm as he spoke through her shock. The ambulance smelled of rubber and ozone. The siren was a thin animal cry that ate the city's night. In the emergency room, Dr. Amelia Chen met them with clipped efficiency that still held a human undertone. The diagnosis was fractured ribs, a concussion, and internal bleeding that required immediate surgical intervention to control a lacerated spleen. Samuel Price arrived later, face pale in the fluorescent corridor, and Nathan stood in the corner with honey, his hands in dirt under his nails, looking like a man who had been exposed. The scene in the operating room was clinical in a way that felt almost ceremonial. Monitors with steady beeps, a tray of surgical tools catching the light, scrubbed hands passing scalpel and clamp. The technical explanation of the surgery was concise. A laparotomy to access and repair the splenic laceration, vessel ligation to control hemorrhage, and careful hemostasis to prevent further bleeding, followed by an intensive care monitoring period for potential complications such as infection or postoperative bleeding. That description, clinical and exact, held its own terror. Elena woke later to the sterile scent of hospital sheets and the soft murmur of voices that had replaced the orchestra of the crash. Nathan sat by the bedside with a cup of cold tea, fingers wrapped around a paper cup as if it could anchor him. In the recovery room, the roles had reversed. The caretaker was now the one being cared for by strangers with stethoscopes and charts. Nathan learned the rhythm of nursing shifts, of medication times, and of how to change dressings with gloves trembling at first and steadying with practice. His hands, used to the delicate care of bees, translated into something urgent and human as he adjusted pillows and smoothed the blanket over Elena's feet. Those hours in recovery were where the slow shift began. Nurses brought warm broth that tasted like home, and the hospital's coffee tasted like thin comfort. Dr. Amelia Chen explained in measured tones the plan for physical therapy and what signs to watch for, her voice a mixture of medical fact and careful empathy. Nathan sat for long stretches, humming low notes that felt like hymns, and gently touched Elena's hair to move it from her forehead. Their conversations in hospital rooms became extended exchanges that wound around fear and apology and confession. Elena asked, "Why did you not tell me who you were?" And Nathan answered, "I did not know it myself." And then she asked, "Did you ever love me?" And he said, "From the day I met you." And each line between them lengthened like thread being knotted into a new rope. Rebecca, who visited with magazines and an extra sweater, watched their first tentative intimacy grow into something steadier. She told Elena quietly, "You are both better than this bargain." And Elena, still weak from surgery, listened and let a laugh come out small and true. Doctors talked in clinical terms about recovery protocols and occupational therapy, and Dr. Amelia Chen sketched out a plan of wound care, pulmonary exercises, and monitoring for signs of infection or clotting. The next weeks were lined with physical therapy sessions, with Nathan learning to lift trays and help Elena to walk down hallways without pulling on stitches. Those shared tasks built intimacy not on heat, but on the strange gravity of tending to another human being when they were fragile and unadorned. The twist that reshaped everything arrived late one rainy afternoon in the form of a letter and an old photograph found among Nathan's few belongings. Elena was folding a pillowcase when she found the edges of a document tucked into his jacket, an inheritance registry, a sealed notice from an estate lawyer that named Nathan Cole as the secret heir to the Merrick Foundation, a dynasty with lands, investments, and a fortune that had always been rumored but never proven. The photograph showed a boy at a picnic, laughing with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to a woman Nathan had once described as family. Nathan sat across from her, face pale with the memory, and for the first time the humble beekeeper story unfurled into something complicated. He had been hidden, raised away from the penthouse and the boardroom by relatives who feared creditors and reputations, taught to love bees and the work of the land, while his true name was kept in a box for reasons of protection. Elena read the documents aloud while Nathan's voice shook and confessed details in an extended conversation that stretched into one of those slow nights where they had many exchanges about identity, privacy, and forgiveness. The revelation did not erase the bargain that had begun with Vincent's offer, but it made the readable surface of their lives far more complex. Nathan had loved simply and honestly. He had never used his lineage as currency. Vincent's plan had been based on assumptions at odds with reality. Claire Benson and Samuel Price met later to assess paperwork and inheritance claims, each exchange of legal phrasing a reminder that money reshapes people and choices in ways that can be brutal and inadvertent. Tension returned in heavier, more violent shapes when evidence of betrayal was revealed to be a planted lie. Elena confronted Vincent in a scene that pulled air like a bellows and forced truth into light. Their conversation moved in a dozen searing exchanges. Elena accused, "You set this up." And he replied, "I offered you an option." And she said, "You lied." And he countered, "I protected you in a way you cannot understand." Words became weapons, and the room smelled of coffee and old paper, the hush of the penthouse like a silent jury. Nathan, who had until then worn the quiet of the hives, defended Elena with a force that surprised him. He challenged Vincent in a voice steady with anger. "How could you use her like this?" And Vincent shrugged as if the world was a ledger where some people had to be sacrificed. The struggle ended with Vincent's threats, thinly veiled now, and a promise he made into a laugh that did not reach his eyes. The moment of tension lasted long enough to leave bruises on the soul, the kind of pain that becomes a memory with an edge. In the aftermath, Elena found evidence that exonerated Nathan and implicated Vincent, a string of emails, a photograph altered, a phone log that did not match the timeline Vincent had insisted upon. The discovery made the legal battle inevitable and ugly, and the community that had watched from porches assembled opinions as if on a street outside a courthouse. These moments of confrontation were heavy, the dialogue clipped and precise, 500 to 600 characters of sharpness in each of 2 paragraphs that could have been taken from transcripts. As recovery continued, so did the slow, affectionate labor of building a life. The household transformed into a place where ritual and small kindnesses became pledges rather than obligations. Elena learned how to lift frames when hives needed to be moved. Nathan learned how to iron shirts without shriveling them. They argued about money less and made lists more. The baby came as an unexpected promise, a small test strip with 2 lines that Elena held against fluorescent light and could not breathe through for a minute. The news rolled into their days like a new season. Surprise, joy, fear, calculation. Dr. Amelia Chen guided them through the early prenatal tests, explaining in clinical but gentle terms what to expect, while Rebecca sewed tiny garments and Samuel Price adjusted budgets with a precision that finally felt useful. The announcement rippled outward, changing the tone of conversations at social dinners and quiet mornings. Nathan's lineage became less of a secret and more of a future that promised to reshape obligations and expectations. The presence of a baby reoriented them. Where before there had been debts and contracts, now there was a small life to consider against a backdrop of reputation and inheritance. The epilogue visits them in 3 distinct frames that map how time reshapes memory and consequence. 1 month later, the house smelled of fresh paint and honey. The tiny nursery painted a soft sage with a hand-stitched mobile over the crib. Elena walked slowly, still tender where stitches had been, and Nathan had learned to fetch her tea just the way she liked it, the steam carrying the scent of chamomile and late summer clover. The hospital bills had been settled in part by Vincent's initial payment and in part by a trust release that Claire Benson and Samuel Price had negotiated once Nathan's inheritance claim was lodged, though the legal process still threaded through their days like a faint worry. Rose Hart was home, pale and stubbornly alive, her laughter lighter than it had been at the start, and she spent afternoons on the porch knitting and telling Elena stories of a youth lived in a way that felt larger than the debt that had pulled them apart. The community that had watched now offered congratulations with the awkwardness of people learning to be generous, bringing casseroles and bouquets that smelled of lilies and resolve. 3 months later, the nursery had a small bassinet and a stack of parenting books that Nathan bought and read with the awe of a man learning new languages. Elena had returned to part-time consulting work and to a public face that had once been sharpened by embarrassment. Photos of the couple now circulated with a narrative of redemption, and the press began to write of the Beekeeper heir with a kind of fascination that made Elena uncomfortable. Legal matters had progressed into a negotiation of trustees and a pledge by Nathan to use his resources for a foundation that would support small agricultural businesses and hospital funding, an idea that fit with his sensibility and with Elena's desire to keep the heart of their story humble and useful. They had their first real argument about the foundation at dinner, voices raised and then softened, and in the quiet of agreement they found themselves closer. Friends like Rebecca and Mateo remained steady presences, visiting with casseroles and practical advice, proof that human tenderness is often the scaffolding of transformation. 6 months after the crash, the baby arrived, a small, fierce presence that changed nights into a rhythm of feeding and watching and the small terror of absolute responsibility. The birth was long, a labor attended by Dr. Amelia Chen and a team who had become almost a circle of trust. The child arrived and the world tilted, and the naming was an intimate conversation that reached back to grandmothers and to the land. Nathan and Elena found themselves in a different town, in the sense that the map of their days had been redrawn. They had a presence on a board at the hospital and a modest profile in the papers, a foundation in gestation, and friends who had become family. Vincent's name receded into legal filings and the occasional headline, and his machinations were exposed enough to cost him the public goodwill he had counted on. Elena's reputation, once a measure of what she had lost, became instead a measure of what she had gained by endurance and by the odd grace of circumstance. In small acts, Nathan bringing home jars of honey for the hospital fundraiser, Elena reading to their child in a voice that had learned to be both steady and soft, their redemption was not sudden or cinematic, but granular. They rebuilt a life that kept the memory of sacrifice and the cost of bargains in it, but also made space for laughter and for the careful tending of the everyday. If there is a lesson in how they moved from the brink to a place of fragile peace, it is that human contracts can bind and also be rewritten by kindness. Elena had entered a marriage written out of necessity and fear. She emerged with a partner whose hands knew both the fragile craft of beekeeping and the complex obligations of an inheritance. The hospital that had once been a cavern of dread hosted their child's first checkup. The levers of reputation that had once pressed on her now opened doors that could fund treatments rather than condemn them. In the end, what she bought with her signature was not simply medicine, but a life that required work and honesty and the constant choice to keep caring. The lilies on the windowsill now stood in simple jars, and each morning the sound of bees hummed like a reminder that sweetness comes from patient labor. If anyone asks whether she sold her freedom for another life, the answer is layered. She traded a name for time, and in that time, she and Nathan built something that might not have existed otherwise. Their story did not erase the ledger of pain, but it rewrote its margins with tenderness and responsibility. If this story touched you, leave a comment to say how you would choose under impossible pressure. If you want more narratives that trace the edges of sacrifice and redemption, consider subscribing. The last image is small and stubborn, a jar of honey with a bit of wax on the rim, sunlight through it like a promise that sweetness often requires patience.